Hey everyone, DQDC here. This week on 5 Block Friday, we're creating a craftable item case using just commands. This is a fairly straightforward creation, but most of the fun is with this first command block here that allows us to do custom crafting recipes without any mods or data packs. I'm going to turn these on and grab some items out here. And then to use this creation, I actually need to switch to creative mode. I mean survival mode. I was already in creative mode. You all know what I mean. So now that we're in survival mode, we can open our crafting inventory here. I'll start by just taking one glass block and one stone pressure plate, putting them in my crafting grid. And I have this new display case item. This also works if I have multiple items in the crafting grid. Mostly works. So it'll only craft one at a time, but as soon as I place one down, I get another one straight on my cursor. So it is admittedly kind of janky, cursed custom crafting, but it's custom crafting using the crafting grid. This is actually a very versatile method, and I'll explain more when I explain that command. Now, with our new custom item, you saw it was called a display case. We can place this case in the world and then right click it with an item to have a little item display case with our favorite items slowly rotating and just showing them off for the world. This is just a visual representation. This isn't the actual item stored on the display case. That would be doable with a few more commands, or maybe with just 5 if that were the main focus of the episode. You can also clear the item by just right-clicking with an empty hand and get the display case back by left-clicking the display case. This also has collision, at least sort of collision, as you'll see in a bit, and you can stand on top of it, but you can't place blocks on top of it or do anything like that. It is just entities. There's no block here to actually click. But that's pretty much it for the item itself. It's a pretty straightforward little creation, kind of modeled off of one of my earlier data packs that added a more full-featured item display case. So with that, let's get into the commands that make this work. Our first command takes care of crafting the custom display case item. Start, we limit the command execution to just players. Then we make sure that the player doesn't have anything in their cursor slot. This is the item that is being carried around in the player's inventory by the mouse. Then we check to see if the crafting 0 slot, the top left slot in the 2x2 crafting grid, has a glass block. Then we check if crafting 1, the top right slot, is empty. We check that crafting 2, the bottom left slot, has a stone pressure plate. And we check that crafting slot 3, the bottom right slot, is empty. Because these commands are using an if items subcommand, we could theoretically have much more complicated checks. We could check for items with specific components or NBT data. We could check for tags of items. We could do all sorts of things beyond just a simple ID check. But for the cases of this little tutorial, that's all we really need is just, are these 2 slots the correct items, and are all the other slots completely empty? Assuming the player is ready to craft the item, we then modify multiple slots in the player's inventory using a loot command. The starting slot is the cursor slot. This has an overall slot index of 499, while the crafting grid has slot indexes 500 through 503. Since the loot command modifies slots sequentially, starting with the cursor slot and providing multiple outputs to the loot command. We'll modify the subsequent slots in the player's inventory. The first entry in our loot table is the custom item for creating the display case. The base of this item is a salmon spawn egg, but we run a function to modify some of the components on the item. We set the item name to be display case. We set the item model to be a glass block. If we wanted to have a custom texture here, this is where we would set the reference to our custom texture, but I'm wanting to do this without any resource packs. Then we set enchantment glint override to be true. This gives the item the enchantment glint, which will distinguish it from regular glass blocks in the player inventory. Then we modify the data of the entity that this spawn egg spawns. The new entity ID is an interaction. We set response to be true. This will allow player animation when interacting with the interaction entity. And we add a custom display case tag to the entity so we can find it later. This second loot table entry decreases the count of the stack in the top left crafting slot by 1. The loot type is slots, which means it grabs loot from existing slots in either a block or entity inventory. This slot source field determines what slot we grab the item from. In this case, we're grabbing from the current executing entity, and we're grabbing it from the crafting.0 slot in their inventory. Conveniently, this is the slot that the output of this loot table will end up in. Then we run a function to set the count of the stack to be 1 less than what it previously was. Altogether, this grabs the stack in the player's crafting.0 slot, decreases the count by 1, and puts it right back in the player's crafting.0 slot. This next entry is basically a placeholder to make sure that we move past the crafting.1 slot. If a loot table doesn't put an item from a role, then it doesn't progress to the next inventory slot. So in this case, we're tricking the system by saying we're giving them a light gray stained glass pane, and then immediately decreasing the count of that stack by 1. If we just set the stack size to be 0 when trying to put this roll in place, it wouldn't register an item had been rolled, and so it wouldn't move to the next slot in the inventory. This entry is the exact same as the one for the crafting.0 slot, other than that it decreases the stack size in the crafting.2 slot. This final loot table entry is probably redundant, but it does the same thing as we did for crafting slot 1, where we trick it into putting an empty slot to move to the next loot table entry. The second command takes care of spawning all of the display entities and other helper entities at the location of the interaction when it's been placed by the player using the spawn egg. To start, we execute as all interaction entities that have our custom tag. We move to their position and then align ourselves to the bottom corner of the block that entity is in. Then we update our position to be in the middle of that block, but still tied to the bottom in the y-axis. And then we stop the command if we can find an item display entity with a custom display item tag within 0.01 blocks of us. If this entity exists, that means that the custom entities have already been added to this interaction, and we don't need to add them again. Once we're certain that we need to summon our helper entities, we do so with a summon command that summons an item display along with several passengers. Our base item display is given the custom tag that we looked for earlier in this command. Setting billboard to fixed makes it so that the rotation of the item display is independent of the direction the player is facing. Setting the teleport duration here to 2 helps the entity rotate smoothly when we change its rotation in later commands. When summoning a display entity, either item displays or block or text displays, if you want to modify any of the transformation elements, you have to set all of them at the start. The values here for left and right rotation are just the default values that apply no extra rotation. This translation here moves the middle of the item display to be the middle of the block that we're executing in, And this scale here sets the scale to be 0.707 in each dimension. This was chosen because as 1/2 of square root 2, this will allow any item that's inside the outer display block to rotate freely without ever clipping outside of the block. The first passenger that our item display has is a block display. We give this block display a custom tag so we can find it later. We set the block being displayed by this block display to be a glass block. We set billboard to fixed so that this display doesn't rotate based on the player's rotation. Again, we have to set every element of the transformation, even though we're only changing the translation in this case. Here, we use the translation to set the origin of this block display back to the lowest corner of the block we're executing it. The next entity we spawn is another block display. This one shows the small stone pedestal at the base of the display case. We give the pedestal a custom tag so we can find it later. We set the block state of the block shown by this display to be a stone pressure plate. Then, using the transformation field, we scale the pressure plate down to 3/4 in each dimension, and then adjust the translation so that it is still centered in the block. The final entity we summon is a happy ghast. This provides collision with the block and allows us to stand on top of it, even if it doesn't allow us to place other blocks on the side of this block. We give the happy ghast a custom tag to find it later. We set the happy ghast to have no AI, to be silent, and to be invulnerable. We use this attributes field to modify the scale of the happy ghast to be 1/5 of its normal size. This makes it slightly smaller than a full block in each direction. Then we give an infinite invisibility effect without any particles to the happy ghast. Our third command takes care of updating the item in the item display to match what the player is holding when they interact with it. To start, we execute as all interaction entities that have our custom tag. We only continue if the entity has interaction data. If that's the case, we update our position to be in the middle bottom of the block that this interaction entity is located in. This is the same exact position that we summoned all of our helper entities at as well. Then we use a kind of cheaty store subcommand to clear the interaction data from the entity. If we set the interaction to be a byte with a value of 0, the game will realize that this is an invalid interaction field, so it just completely removes the interaction field from the entity on the next tick. Then we update the executing entity to be the target of this interaction. This is the entity that interacted with it last. Keep in mind that we have not updated our execution position, so we're still positioned in the middle of the interaction entity. At this point, we just run an item replace command to replace the item in the display entity with the item in the player's main hand. Our fourth command takes care of removing the display case when it's attacked. Again, we start by executing as all interaction entities that have our custom tag. Then we only continue if the entity has any attack data, meaning a player has left-clicked it. If that's the case, we update our execution position to be the middle of the block again. We use a similar store subcommand trick to clear the attack data after this tick. Then, because unlike most entities, interactions and display entities aren't destroyed when their Y value gets too low, we use a store subcommand to move the position of this entity to be as low as possible in the X, Y, and Z direction. This will put it in a chunk that is completely inaccessible without modding the game. Even if you set the world border to be the maximum, there is no way to get to this position. I would have really preferred if I could do something to just kill all these entities, but I couldn't quite get everything to fit into 5 commands and kill the display entities properly. So we're stuck with just moving things to the corner of the world. We do the same thing to the nearest item display and block displays that have our custom tags, effectively removing them from the game without actually killing them. Then, because the happy ghast is a living entity, we can just put its Y value very low and it will automatically be removed from the game on the next tick. Once we've set things up so that all of our custom entities will be removed within the next game tick, we use a loot command to summon a new item display case item. The loot table entry here is identical to the one in the first command for creating the custom item in the first place. Our fifth command is the most straightforward, and it takes care of rotating the display item in the display case. To start, we execute as all item display entities that have our custom tag. We use the store subcommand to store the result of whatever comes after the run statement to the first rotation field of the entity. We then ensure that this value is a float and scale it up by a factor of 2. Then the actual run command we're running is just getting the current game time in ticks. Since game time goes up by 1 tick per tick, and we're scaling this up by 2, this means the item will rotate 2 degrees every tick. This comes out to be 40 degrees every second, meaning it takes about 9 seconds to do a full rotation of the item. The speed of the item rotation can, of course, be adjusted by just changing the scale in the store subcommand here. That is it for this episode of 5 Block Friday. If you enjoyed this creation, please consider leaving a like or a comment down below. And if you want to see the rest of the creations we have planned this season, please consider subscribing so you don't miss those when those come out. With that said, I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you all in the future.